There isn't one. Every single generation has come up with a new excuse for hatred against the state of Israel. The issue of Palestine and the land there is only the most recent of it. It's a spiritual battle, and it's a spiritual battle. It's a war against God himself. It's a war against humanity. It's a war against God's purpose, not only for the state of Israel, but to bless all the nations of the earth, which is what God promised Abraham right at the beginning when he made this covenant and gave him the land of Israel as an everlasting possession. The Bible says this: we don't fight against flesh and blood. We're fighting against principalities and powers and spiritual wickedness in high places. Hamas are clear about this in their charter. We, as John has said earlier to us there, Pastor John said to us, in our Western mindset, our secular mindset, we don't get this. Hamas does not stand for self-determination of the Palestinians. They stand for the annihilation of the Israelis, and they stand for the victory of their God, Allah. Am I making this up? I'm going to quote the Hamas Charter, 1988, Article 6 states, an Islamic resistance is a distinguished Palestinian movement whose allegiance is to Allah, whose way of life is Islam. It strives to raise the banner of Allah over every inch of Palestine. As with that other genocidal charter, Mein Kampf, people refuse to believe what is clearly written until it's too late. I'm going to quote the Article 7 of the Hamas Charter. It's shocking. The day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight Jews and kill them. And as Jesus said, another Jew, by the way, somebody was shocked in my office when I said, you know that Jesus was a Jewish rabbi? Here's what he says: by their fruits you will know them. So let's look at the fruits of two different groups of people, of the Jewish people and of this terrorist organization. I went down to a couple of years ago to the Gaza envelope, as it's called, where so much of this atrocities take place. I met a man called Elan Isaacson. He was the head of security for the Eshkol region. And I was very impressed by him. He was talking about being under the rocket fire and all the rest of it. Now, I know I'm short of time, so I'm going to cut it short. But here's the thing that struck me. He spoke of the sympathy for the people of Gaza being held hostage by the terror organization of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Yeah. And he poured his heart out, and he said, I look back to the time, before we disengaged in 2006 and Hamas took over and so on. These people were our friends. They came over, they worked with us. We got to know them, we visited their homes. And his heart went out for them. And although they are in the enemy camp this day, his heart was still for them. And I've heard that over and over and over again from Jews in Israel. In what other nation does that happen? They don't demonize their enemies. Israel is a miracle. And as John has said, the Jewish people certainly have their faults, and Israel has its faults, and we certainly do in ours. But I'm going to say this: because of this book, the Jewish people are the most ethical people on the whole face of the planet by far. From what other nation would there be a statement like Prime Minister Golda Meir? She said, when peace comes, we will perhaps in time be able to forgive the Arabs for killing our sons. But it will be harder for us to forgive them for having forced us to kill their sons. Peace will come when the Arabs will love their children more than they hate us. And so finally, just as I come to the end, I'm just shortening my message here. The Jewish people don't call for vengeance. What's needed is not vengeance. The IDS have a job to do. They have to clean out the nest of vipers. But what's needed is a change of heart. And the psalm I read there, it talks about this incredible anti-Semitic thing coming against Israel. But you can read that psalm and it doesn't pray for vengeance, not even once. The psalm actually prays for the enemies of Israel, that they might be defeated once and for all, but he recognizes the root of the conflict. They don't know God. They're a godless people. Their God is not the God of the Bible. And so he prays that the enemies of Israel would come to know the God of Israel. Amen. And just in closing, last Saturday, as all of this was unfolding Saturday of a week ago, my wife Pamela and I, we read the parashah every morning together. And as these events were unfolding last week, the reading for Saturday, Simchat Torah, was from the book of Joshua, chapter 1. And in it, God reminds his people of the covenant that he's made with Abraham. He reminds his people of the covenant that he repeated again with Moses at Mount Sinai, giving the land to them. And as they are making Aliyah and coming into the land, God says, "This is the land that I have given you." Now, I want Jews who are here, and Israelis especially, to listen to these words very closely. You are now in the land that God has given you. That is your land. It's called the promised land in the Bible. These are difficult and costly days ahead. But here's what God said in the parashah a week ago, even as these things were unfolding. I'm going to try my Hebrew and then I'll read it in English. Hazach ve'matz al tarobs ve'al tehat kimeka Adonai elecha bechol aser telech. Be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid, nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Amen.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, our final speaker before we march to the embassy is Alan Shatter. Many of you obviously know him well, but some of you in the Israeli community might not. Alan was a TD for over 30 years in the Fine Gael party. He was also Minister for Justice, Equality and Defence, and he now works as chairman of Magen David Adom Ireland, Israel's National Emergency and Blood Donation Services. Thank you, Alan.
I'm here this afternoon wearing a number of hats. I'm an Irish citizen, I'm a member of Ireland's small Jewish community, I'm a former member of this House for over 30 years, I'm a former Irish Minister for Justice, a former chairman of our Foreign Affairs Committee in the Parliament, a former chairperson and founding member of the Ireland-Israel Parliamentary Friendship Group, which never had more than a few members of this House join it. I'm also someone who over the years has visited the Middle East regularly, Israel, the West Bank. I've been in Gaza. I've known over the years nearly all of the leading Israeli politicians, those who tried to negotiate with the Palestinians, and I've met over the years and known Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, and the various Palestinian negotiators. I've been there during the ebb and flow when conflicts have broken out and conflicts have been resolved. And I've been there because of my commitment and belief that the only way this conflict will ever end is by what everyone calls a two-state solution. But I also believe that has no possibility of happening during my lifetime. And I believe that simply because of what I've learned and experienced in the engagements that I've had. And the difficulty in Ireland is that what is blindingly obvious is entirely ignored by practically 100% of the members of the House of the Oireachtas, and is only now starting to be recognised by some, and I emphasise some, members of government. Because the reality is there's no solution to this conflict for as long as Hamas exists and for as long as Hamas rules with an iron fist in Gaza. You've heard reference to the Hamas Charter. Well, Hamas, as should be clear to every person by now who lives on this island, is nothing more than a fundamentalist Islamic death cult dedicated to murdering Jews. And that is their focus. Their focus is not the well-being of Palestinians in Gaza. Palestinians in Gaza who've attempted to engage in dialogue with Israelis have found themselves arrested, threatened, beaten up. Hamas has well described itself what it is. Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, talking to at a meeting back in 2014 or 15, depicted the difference between what he described as his people, and I do not apply this to all of the Palestinian people. He was referencing his people, that is those who are members of Hamas. He depicted the difference as the following. Our people, he said, value death. The Israelis value life. He apparently thought valuing death was a greater moral platform to be standing on than valuing life. And their perspective of death was barbarically on display in a manner that no rational person could deny last Saturday. 1,300 men, women and children mercilessly shot, barbarically raped, burnt alive. Jews haven't been burnt alive since the Holocaust. And far too many of members of this House behind me seem to think this is a minor detail, as is decapitating children. And there are far too many people in this country who think decapitating children and murdering children doesn't matter. For those of you who bother to engage in the toxic environment of social media, there are Irish people, identifiably Irish people, living in this country, rowing about whether children who were murdered were truly decapitated. It doesn't seem to bother them that the children were murdered. What is wrong with these people? And tragically and sadly for this country, that applies also to some members of this House. Now, I want to acknowledge that the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach, on the day of the events in Israel, the unspeakable events, very rapidly, unequivocally condemned the actions of Hamas. It took the leader of Sinn Féin 3 days to unequivocally do that. Only when it became clear that one of our own citizens had been abducted, later to be discovered murdered, Kim Dante, a beautiful 22-year-old girl at the start of her life, cruelly killed for the offence, God help us, of going to a musical concert. And then, a couple of days later, it emerged that Emily Hand, an 8-year-old daughter of an Irish man living in Israel, was also brutally murdered. Politicians knew in this House, most, that at the very least they had to condemn what happened. But people started equivocating after that. It's moved on. For some reason, as the media forgot that rockets were being fired at Israel, the Taoiseach felt the need to warn people that Israel might overreact. There was a gesture towards acknowledging by the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach, and they were right to acknowledge it, that Israel has a right of defence. But there was a rapid amnesia set in on the part of some, including the Taoiseach, that the rockets being fired at Israel, which to this afternoon continue to be fired, were deeply embedded in civilian areas, were being shot at from beside schools, beside homes, beside hospitals. Hamas has a major headquarters under one of the biggest hospitals in Gaza to this moment. whispers were starting to come out. The Israelis might overreact. Well, I know any country whose citizens were the repetitive targets for rocket fire, whose citizens had been mercilessly assassinated. As the rockets continue to come, that country has no obligation other than to defend its citizens. And that country has no obligation other than to go after those who are trying to kill their citizens and trying to wipe out that country. And that country must understand that there isn't a proportionate response. I'll tell you what, if you kill one of ours, we'll shoot one of yours. That's not what this is about. What's been happening in the last week also, as is wrongly depicted by media and some in political life, is not retaliation. It has nothing to do with retaliation. It is Israel as a country, as the independent, only Jewish state in the world, as the only democratic Jewish nation state in the Middle East, defending its citizens against attack by terrorists whose rockets are embedded in civilian areas. I have never met an Israeli, be it on the right or left of Israeli politics, who wants to kill Palestinian civilians or Palestinian children. The Israeli Defense Forces take extraordinary precautions to avoid that. So, could we have a little less from Irish politicians about lecturing Israelis as to how they should defend their own country? That is what Israelis are entitled to make decisions on themselves. And could we have less equivocation? Could we also deliver a message to those members of this House who are not merely simply ambiguous, but are clearly, unambiguously anti-Semitic and committed to the destruction of the Israeli state? Let's stop using nice language about this. Sinn Féin. A myriad of Sinn Féin TDs until recently had the words, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," on their social media accounts. The social media accounts were whitewashed and cleansed a few months ago as the possibility of Sinn Féin coming into government re-emerged. But there's one, at least, Deputy Chris Andrews, who within 4 days of over 1,000 Israelis being slaughtered was running up that pole all over again. And then we had the obscenity of what happened in Dublin yesterday. We've already heard of last Monday night. In Dublin yesterday, thousands of people, far too many young Irish people, misled by the false narrative about Israel that is on a weekly basis articulated and narrated in Leinster House, marched through the streets of Dublin, ended up outside the Israeli embassy, and Deputy Boyd Barrett led the chant, "From the river to the sea, Israel will be free." And as he did so, he got increasingly hysterical, replicating the conduct he engaged in the Dáil only a few days ago when asking questions about events in Gaza. God forbid he'd mention the death of Israelis. He stood on the back of the truck or whatever platform he was on, literally screaming. The veins in his neck bulged with hate as he screamed, and the image I had in my head was of a little man who was around in the 1930s, and the only difference between Boyd Barrett and that little man is Boyd Barrett doesn't have a moustache. Only difference. Some politicians in this country are a disgrace. Stop lecturing to Israel how to defend its citizens. Remember that in the 1930s and 40s, this country was a bystander as 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. Remember, this country closed its doors to Jews trying to escape Germany in the 1930s and barely admitted a few after the concentration camp gates were opened. This country has been on the wrong side of history every time the Jewish people have been persecuted. And there is a serious risk that this country is again slowly walking onto the wrong side of history, because Israel has no choice but to defend its citizens, to prevent atrocities like we've seen last Saturday and Sunday. Israel has no choice but to root Hamas out of Gaza. And it's a horrible and difficult thing to try and do within the context of what's happening. But no matter what Israel does, they're criticised. Of course there's concern about the people of Gaza. Of course there's concern that ordinary people are losing their lives. There's never been a conflict in history when ordinary innocent people don't lose their lives, and none of us should be sanguine about that. But if they're losing their lives, it's because Hamas chose to locate their rockets and embed them in civilian areas. So Israel was being criticised for trying to prevent rockets going into Israel. There's a difficulty in Ireland and a difficulty with Irish politicians. Irish politicians are very happy commemorating the Jewish dead. On Holocaust Memorial Day, they'll turn up. They'll even deliver speeches saying, "Never again." What they find difficult is Jewish people defending life and defending themselves. And they think they should tell them how to go about doing that. And I say you should not, and you've no right to do it. You should be embarrassed by the history of this country. I want to conclude by coming back very briefly to something I said. The next couple of weeks are going to be difficult. Perhaps politicians behind me, instead of for easy sound bites with the media in the hope of getting a few transfers from Sinn Féin voters in the next election, instead of lecturing Israel as to how it should go about defending its citizens, perhaps they'd focus on calling for the release of the hostages. Perhaps they'd focus on calling for the rockets to stop flying into Israel. There wasn't a single person on that obscene march yesterday, not a single person, on any platform who called for the release of the hostages or for the rockets to stop. My father lived in England in the 1930s, and he used to tell me about the marches of Oswald Mosley going through the East End to confront the Jews who lived there. And eventually the Jews who lived there got fed up, and they confronted the English Nazis led by Mosley on the streets. And my father was in the middle of that at some stage. The march I saw in Dublin reminded me of the Mosley march on the streets of London in the 1930s. What we are seeing in Dublin, encouraged by people who pretend to be left-wing politicians but are nothing other than right-wing anti-Semites. What we are seeing in Dublin is the Third Reich on the streets of Dublin. They're a small minority, but there's too many of them, and they're dangerous, and we need to fight back. And we should see what we're doing here as not only supporting Israel, but part of that fight back and saying no to fascism in Ireland, no to anti-Semitism in Ireland, no to closet support for barbaric, fundamentalist Islamic terrorists sponsored and encouraged by Iran. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Okay, we're now going to walk down to the Embassy of Israel. We're going to walk towards Stephen's Green and then turn left onto Bagot Street and down Northumberland Roadway. So when we get there to the embassy, we'll be met by Jerusalem Council 2 group, Christian Friends of Israel, and also Rabbi Yoni. So I know there's quite a few of us, so maybe if you just bear with us, we're gonna head up to the top of the group here, facing Stephen's Green, and then when you see the crowd move, just follow us down. Okay? Thank you very much.